and we'll just start marching through this. And so I relied on a lot of sources for this. That my aunt had deposited some papers of hers at the Maine Historical Society, and I started there. But I ended up going to the Library of Congress, and most of the historic photos in this presentation are from the National Women's Party papers at the Library of Congress. The newspapers in Maine are in Portland and Lewiston and the Kennebec Journal in Augusta, 1914 to 1920. I looked at all of them, and I read just extensive suffrage, Maine, and U.S. history because I didn't know any of this history, and I think probably like a lot of you, I hadn't really learned much of it at school. So I had a lot of sort of background to figure out before I could write the book. So here's another view of Florence. She came late to suffrage, but I'll start with just some background about her. She was born and grew up in Augusta. This is the house that she grew up in at 7 Spruce Street, which is kind of across the river from the State House complex. And she went to school in Augusta. That house is still there, by the way. She went, and this is her dad. Samuel Spencer Brooks, who was owned a hardware store and dabbled in shipbuilding as well, as a lot of people did a lot of businessmen did at the time. This is her mother, Mary Caroline Wodsworth Brooks, and so she was from the Wadsworth Longfellow family, and so she's they're distantly connected to the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Perhaps that sparked her early interest in writing. This is her younger sister, Daisy. Florence was actually the 4th of 5 children and the first girl in that family. So she grew up in Augusta. She went to the Augusta public schools. And then for high school, she went to something called St. Catherine's Hall, which was basically a finishing school affiliated with the Episcopal Church. And so her family was one of the early families to buy into what became a flourishing middle-class summer colony on Squirrel Island off the coast of Boothbay, off of the coast of Maine, off of Boothbay Harbor. And so here, this is, here she is with some friends and stuff on Squirrel. It kind of looks like this man is choking her. That's actually her older brother, Percy, who's, I think, cranking her chin around to look at the camera. And I love this picture because we tend to think of our leaders as these sort of stodgy people who are all, dressed up and always act responsibly. And you can see that she's just kind of, they're just fooling around. They're young people fooling around. And so next to her is the man who becomes her husband, Robert Whitehouse. And then I'm not sure who the mutton chops woman is. Sleeves. That's a heck of a uniform to be wearing in the summer in Maine, though. So one of the interesting things about Squirrel was that women, at a time when women couldn't vote in Maine, the women of Squirrel could own property on an equal basis with men and vote in the association on an equal basis. So, that again have sparked her later interest in suffrage, although, as I said, she came late to it. So I just want to back up and say, after she graduated from St. Catherine's Hall, she decided she didn't want to go to college. I'm certain that her father could have afforded to send her to college, but she really wanted to study music and art and languages, and so she found herself some masters to study with in Boston and spent a couple winters down there doing that, and then took off for an extensive 18-month trip around Europe and the Holy Lands. And she met a family called the McCormicks, who's, Cyrus McCormick had invented the Reaper, so they had quite a bit of money. And she ended up spending an entire winter sailing up and down the Nile River with the McCormicks. And she kept a journal, and she did a lot of sketches of the beauty of Egypt and the Nile, and these became the basis for her later books. She ended up publishing 2 novels, and the first was this one, but she didn't go straight to writing novels. She ended up coming back to Maine to marry Robert Whitehouse, and the family myth is that he had heard that she was having some sort of romance over in Egypt, and so he sailed over to bring her home. I've never been able to document that, but it's a fun story. And the one thing I'm sure of is that if she hadn't wanted to go or come back to Maine, she wouldn't have done it to marry him. I mean, she was very independent, obviously, and she married for love, and she married for an egalitarian relationship. He had to have been willing to give her that, and or to agree to that. So that's what she came back to, and they married in 1894, and ended up moving to Portland. He was also from Augusta. His father was William Penn Whitehouse, who was the Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Court. And so the young couple moves to Portland, and they get set up in a house on 42 Deering Street. And at first they do a lot of fun stuff together. I mean, they don't have kids. They're in the big city kind of, and she starts a writing club, and they start writing plays together, and they act in them and perform and direct them, and then put them on for audiences for charity in places up and down the coast, from Portland up to Boothbay Harbor and then on Squirrel. So that's all going swimmingly, but then, and he's in private practice at the time. He was an attorney, like his dad, and so he's in private practice, and he gets really busy, and he says to her, well, look, why don't you just keep this writing stuff going, but write some novels based on the plays that you've already written, because you're so good at that. So that's what ends up happening. And her first book is The God of Things, this book here, which she also illustrated, so you can get a good sense of her art, her artistic ability. There's a bunch of these very fine drawings throughout the book. And so Little Brown and Company, publishing company, published this, and it's marketed from coast to coast. I still have her scrapbook of her press clippings, which is kind of fun. And so everything's going great. And then she comes up with a second book that's published in 1904. The Effendi, which is, both of these books are based on, she calls them kind of romances of the Sudan. And at the time, there was a huge fascination with Egypt and the Middle East generally. There was a very romantic, and I'm sure completely, unrealistic sort of knowledge of what that culture was like and what the area was like. But so they were pretty well received. She wrote the second book, or published it when she was on bed rest, pregnant with my grandfather, because by this time she had 3 kids, he was her third kid. My grandfather is the Brooks Whitehouse, and he's the one up above, on her right there, with a little page boy haircut. And then the eldest one was William Penn. He's in front of Brooks, and then the other one was Robert Treat, named after his dad. So she's pretty busy at this point, and she doesn't write anything, or at least doesn't publish much for the next several years. And then in 1908, when he was 4 years old, Brooks comes down with polio, which was, of course, a very serious disease, and he was on an iron lung. He was very, very sick, and she just dropped everything to take care of him and make sure that he would be all right. And it took a while, but he eventually was, and he always credited her with saving his life, and not just his life, but his ability to live an active and healthy life, because she was determined that he wouldn't be an invalid. And she massaged his legs to keep his nerves and his muscles healthy, or as healthy as possible, and got him up and moving around, made sure he had operations later on to correct problems in his gait. And he was later able to play tennis and hunt, and he did lead quite an active life. So anyway, it took that took several years for that process to walk through it, or to move through. And by 1912, 1913, she's starting to look around and think, well, what am I going to do now? I mean, her older boys are off at prep school. Brooks is back in school and doing pretty well. And so she gets involved with Portland's progressive movement with her husband, and with all the other, more affluent families that they hang out with. And they're looking at ways to make Portland a better place to live. And they're looking at things like the what they called the white slavery or prostitution, various alcohol use, cleaner streets and clean food supply, all those kinds of things. And she starts realizing, it's kind of a problem that women can't vote. And then one night she goes to a lecture that's put on by a woman named Mrs. Morrill Hamlin, who was, did these lectures by subscription at the Congress Square Hotel. And she went to this lecture, and Mrs. Hamlin, even though she made money touring around talking on all these subjects, was an anti-suffragist or an anti. And so she laid out all these arguments why women shouldn't vote. And Florence tried to argue with her, but realized she really didn't have the sort of arguments at her fingertips. And so she finally said to her, look, I'm going to go away and I'm going to research this thoroughly for the next 6 months. And then I'll come back and we'll have a debate, and then we'll see. And so that's how she came to be active in suffrage, to get involved in it. And I'm just going to read you some quotes from her. Somebody asked her once, a reporter asked her why she ended up giving herself so completely to suffrage, because she gradually did that to the exclusion of everything else, at least in these early years. And she said, because I believe that the work I do for suffrage is 50 times more valuable than 10 times the work on charities or any social work would be. She said that charitable work, didn't get at the root cause of social ills. Low wages forced families to go hungry and send their kids to work instead of to school. And because women weren't offered very many types of jobs, they were driven to prostitution and things like that. So she says, well, when women do vote, they won't be satisfied to skim the top of the pool of social corruption any longer, but they will pave it with clean cobblestones and put a drain through it and connect the source with a bubbling spring. Women are the conservers of the race, and men are the consumers. So I love that quote because she really goes out, stakes a much more out there kind of position than most suffragists at the time would have been willing to do. And that was the case kind of throughout her suffrage career. She was always looking, a lot of women thought that the right to vote would help them just to clean up their streets and the food supply and get better education for their children. And she certainly believed that too. But I think she also believed that women needed more equality with men in many other spheres. And that's where I think she was termed to be a radical. That's part of what earned her that tag. Anyway, so she gets involved. This is around the time she gets involved with suffrage. She initially joins what's called the Maine Woman Suffrage Association, or MISA, and it's affiliated with the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which is kind of this creaky old battleship. It's the legacy suffrage organization. It's been around for decades. Started by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they really favor a state-by-state approach. For them, the amendment is a secondary kind of consideration, and famously around the time Florence gets involved, I think they had allotted a budget of about $20 a year for the federal amendment lobby, and the woman who was in charge of it returned change at the end of the year. So it gives you a sense that it wasn't a big focus for them, and they were really focused on being non-confrontational, non-political, non-partisan, and they accepted incremental progress. It wasn't a case for them that they wanted suffrage now. I mean, they certainly would have taken suffrage now, but they weren't going to step outside the bounds of womanly behavior in order to demand it. And Anna Howard Shaw was the president at the time Florence joined, and Carrie Chapman Catt took over from her. Here's Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt. I like to show these pictures of women because these women ought to be in our history books in a way that they aren't really now. I mean, generally women are very unrepresented in our American history. So I like to show their faces. Anyway, so Florence joins the Maine Woman Suffrage Association, and she's quickly kind of termed a rising star. She's already proven her ability to write. She's comfortable on stage, so she's good at debating. She's artistic, so she can design posters and things if she needs to. She's well connected politically and socially. She's affluent. She doesn't have to work, so she can devote herself to suffrage. And she has a passion for the cause. So she's just exactly what they're looking for, because the leaders, many of the main leaders at this point, have been doing this for a long time, and they're tired. They need more young people in this fight. And even though as a early 40s, she's not young, she's still younger than some of them. So everything's going swimmingly. And then in 1915, they try to get the state legislature to approve a statewide suffrage referendum, which Maine has never had before. And they gain some ground in the legislature. They get more votes than they've ever had, but they still fall short. And at that point, Florence, who was the chair of the legislative committee for MISA, starts thinking, man, this is why it's going to take another lifetime for this to happen. And she starts looking around, and it turns out there's this rival suffrage organization, this startup that gets started in about 1913 by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, and their focus is 100% on the federal amendment. They want to pass an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women, and they're going to use controversial methods. They're going to hold the political party in power accountable for failing to advance the measure through Congress, and at this time, that's the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson had been elected in 1912, and he had majorities in both houses of Congress. And the other thing, and the way they're going to hold the political party accountable, is that they're going to use the votes of these 4 million women voters in the western part of the country who've won suffrage through a statewide referendum or some other process. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but they want suffrage now. They're not fooling around. They don't want to wait another generation for this to happen. They want it now. And so Alice Paul, here's a picture of her. She's a Quaker from New Jersey, and had worked in suffrage in England, where the suffragists were known to be more militant and kind of combative than American suffragists had been. Here's Lucy Burns, her co-founder and chief lieutenant, also another amazing woman. And here's a fun illustration of how they're going to use the women voters of the West, who are represented by, they're the white states, and this woman voter of glory is striding across the country, coming to the aid of her Eastern sisters who are in the black pit of despair, here in the East, and because they can't vote. And for some reason, all of the states that enfranchise women to this point are west of the Mississippi. So anyway, and the Congressional Union realizes that they're going to need help from state organizations in order to put pressure on their congressional delegations to pass this amendment in Congress. So in 1915, they come knocking on her door in Maine, saying, we want to set up a statewide, a Maine branch of the Congressional Union. Would you be interested? And she says yes. She initially just offered to help, and then they made her president. So she was president of the Maine branch of the CU right from the beginning. And before I get back to her husband, so that was a very controversial move on her part. Her colleagues at MISA were just absolutely aghast that she would do this. They were very loyal to the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and they viewed Alice Paul and the CU with suspicion. They thought they were interlopers. They thought their tactics were all wrong. And so it was a big deal when Florence agreed to be president, but she said to them, look, when I work on the national stuff, I'll work with the CU, and when I work on the state referendum stuff, I'll work with you guys. It'll be fine. Trust me, we can work this out. And so it was for a short time. And I want to acknowledge that her husband was very supportive of suffrage, as was his dad. His dad actually had been part of a group of people who called for a statewide suffrage organization back in 1872, I think. And so his dad had been very supportive, and Robert created this Men's Equal Suffrage League, which he chaired until 1920, and he did a lot to support suffrage, including financing a big chunk of it along the way. So here she is. This is her press photo when she joins the Congressional Union. And as I said, for a time, things were really all right. I mean, she manages to walk this sort of tightrope between the two organizations. And I want to point out that this might seem a little bit of an aside, but you hear a lot these days about how racist the suffragists were. And I just want to point out that when she gets the Congressional Union going in Maine, she writes to her congressional delegation and asks them about a federal amendment. So this is a response she gets from a U.S. Senator from Maine, Charles Johnson. And he says, you know, here he is, a senator from Maine. He says, I'm not in favor of an amendment to the Constitution. And he cites as the reason the state of Mississippi has a white population of about the same size as the state of Maine, but also has these pesky 1.2 million Negro population. And the enfranchisement of the male Negro population forced a most difficult situation upon Mississippi and the other southern states, and I'm not willing by my vote to aid in increasing the burden. So you can see, so, you know, think about this. How many blacks were there in Maine at the time? I mean, maybe 1,000, but he's saying he's not going to foist equal suffrage for women on the southern states because it's going to cause them some problems with their black population. So this is what the women were up against, and it was a tough decision for them, and it's one of the reasons why they don't sort of take up the challenge of dealing with the race question and end up narrowing their focus more and more simply on getting woman suffrage, just like let's get something done. So in 1916, it's a presidential election year, and the Congressional Union follows through on its threat to hold the political party in power, the Democrats, responsible for failing to advance their measure through Congress. And so they fan out in the western states, and they tell people, we don't care who you vote for, just don't vote for the Democrats. You know, we're not telling you vote for Republicans or vote for some other party. And there were other party options in those days. Just don't vote for the Democrats. And so Alice Paul hires Florence to go out to Wyoming to campaign against the Democrats out there. And this is when she really gets into hot water with the people back home. And in this photo, she's in Chicago on her way out to Wyoming. And I don't know if you can see her, but she's holding the sign. She's back a little bit, holding the sign that says, "Why does Wilson seek votes from women when he opposes votes for women?" They're on the right side of the screen. And she and the woman in front of her, who was the chair of the Illinois branch of the Congressional Union, had led this procession out of headquarters down the street. And they lined up along the block. This is actually half the photo. There was a whole other group of women not in this photo, all holding signs, because Wilson was in town to give an important foreign policy speech. So he comes up, he gets into he gets out of his carriage, goes into the building, and they're not saying a word. They're just letting their signs speak for them, and they're, being fairly respectful. But all of a sudden, this mob that's lined up, they're kind of behind the women. I don't know if you can see them. They attack them out of the blue. I mean, they come after them. They grab the signs. They rip them out of the women's hands. That the women, they don't want to let them go, so they beat on their knuckles until they let go, and they break up the signs, and some women get thrown to the street and their clothes torn and their wrists sprained. And in the end, the mob chases them back to headquarters, to suffrage headquarters, and stands around outside for hours yelling epithets at them. And it was absolutely wonderful as far as Florence was concerned, because it meant that they sent out telegrams all over the country telling women, be sure to publicize this. because we need, people need to know that we were attacked we were protesting peacefully, and we were just attacked out of the blue. And so the next day, it's like front page news on papers all over the country. Florence she had a regular suffrage column in the Lewiston paper, and she sends back a firsthand eyewitness account of this. And so she goes off to Wyoming. She campaigns there for a couple of weeks. She has a blast. She takes a side trip to Yellowstone, which she's never seen before. She loves to travel. She hasn't been out of Maine in a while, and does about 2 speeches a day for a couple of weeks, and then she goes back to Maine. And Wilson, of course, is reelected, but with a narrower margin than he had in his first victory. They did succeed in stopping the election of a few members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, and they really got the Democrats' attention, though, by doing this, and made the Democrats absolutely furious, because some of the Democrats were actually pro-suffrage and had been voting for it in the Congress, but as a party, they weren't supporting it in their platform and moving it through Congress, and that's what the CU was objecting to. So by the time they get back, Florence gets back to Maine, she gets this really tight-lipped, frosty reception from her former colleague, well, close to be former colleagues at the Maine Woman Suffrage Association. And the problem with that is that Maine is, for the first time, really close to getting a statewide referendum approved. It's never been able to do it before. Carrie Chapman Catt says, don't do it, you're not ready, you don't have a war chest, you don't have enough experienced suffrage organizers, but they're so excited, they go ahead and approve it anyway. And they go to the legislature in early 1917 and ask for this referendum, and the legislature gives it to them. But the women of the Maine Woman Suffrage Association tell Florence, you're way too controversial at this point. If you're lucky, we're going to let you lick stamps, but that's about all you're going to do for this campaign, because we can't have you out there being the face of it. You're too controversial. And she's kind of like, well, I'm the one who's done all this work to get it to this point. In the last couple of years, she's chair of the legislative committee. She's done all this, coordinate all this lobbying, and her husband has been really involved. And all of a sudden, she's just going to lick stamps and address envelopes. And so she's kind of mad. She's sitting home alone one night thinking about what she's going to do. And there's a knock at the door, and it turns out when she answers it, a bunch of her friends are out there, and they file in and line up in front of the fireplace and tell her, well, we've created a new suffrage organization to work for this referendum campaign, and we want to make you president. Would you accept that? And she was absolutely delighted. She said, yes, of course. So that's how the Suffrage Referendum League of Maine gets formed. And again, it's just formed in order to work on the referendum campaign in 1917. It would be disbanded afterward. And she's president, and on her board are lots of men and women who are kind of from her social class, but all over the state. She tended to do most of the work for it, though. The campaign gets approved in February, and the date for voting on the referendum is set for September 10th. But they get off to a late start because it's a very long, cold Maine winter with lots of snow, and then it's a rainy, cold spring, kind of like ours. And they aren't able to get out into the rural areas to campaign until later in the spring. And by that time, the U.S. had entered World War I in April. And instantly, all of these women who said, oh, I'm going to work full time on this suffrage campaign, and I'm going to give all my money to this suffrage campaign. And all of a sudden, there's this giant pivot to the war, and so they're using up all their money on war bonds and Red Cross drives, and and they're spending all their free time rolling bandages for soldiers and raising money for French war orphans and this, that, and the other thing, and they're not working on suffrage. And Florence too, you can see by this picture, she joins the Red Cross. She heads up their information bureau. Remember, at this time, there's no VA. There's no way for families and service members to communicate, really. There's no coordinating function there. So that's the function this committee ends up playing. And I don't, it was an interesting time because the National American Woman Suffrage Association encouraged all of its members to devote themselves to war work because they had this sort of tacit agreement with Congress, members of Congress, that if they did that, they supported the war, they would, try and see if they could get the suffrage amendment passed after the war. The Congressional Union never said that. Alice Paul was a Quaker, and she said, we're not going to be distracted by another war the way we were in the Civil War. We're just going to keep working on suffrage. And the Suffrage Referendum League of Maine, wasn't part of NASA, and she could have stood down on this one, but her two oldest boys had enlisted in the military, in the Air Force, and I think that may have been in part why she did it. She was supporting her sons and her community and her country. And that's kind of the person she was. So anyway, it's not till June or so that they ended up, being able to get out into the rural areas and start campaigning and kind of focus on this referendum campaign. And she's working really hard on it. She's writing letters. She's trying to raise funds. She's enlisting speakers, organizing rallies. And but it's tough sledding in the face of the war. And one of the things that she did was she had a friend named Frederick Freeman, who did these illustrations, these cartoons under the pen name Will Arcady. So this one you can see on the left, the Grange, the Federation of Labor, and Good Government are on the yes side of the equal suffrage contest, but prejudice, vice, and the high cost of living are on the no side. So choose your side. And here's another one. 8 million women are earning their living outside the home in the United States. And President Wilson calls upon the American women to mobilize for industry and agriculture. So this one says, this is another junker for the scrap heap, that the anti-suffragists have maintained that women's place is in the home. But of course, in the war, they're being exhorted to get outside the home and support the war work. So this is kind of making fun of that. Here's another one. You can see this is the same hat she was wearing in one of those earlier pictures. So this is her buddy Freeman doing this one as well. So, they've already got a problem in the Maine suffrage referendum campaign with the war going on, and then another problem surfaces, which is back in January of that year. Alice Paul starts the picketing of the White House. This is the first group of pickets that go out to stand by the White House gates, which you could do in those days. Now it's pretty bunkered out, but in those days they literally stood on either side of the gates and they could see President Wilson driving in and out on his way to his daily golf game or something. And so these banners are the purple, white, and gold colors of the Congressional Union, and that's what their sashes are too. And they just walked over and stood in front of the gates. But as time went on, they started using more controversial language and more, they were kind of a little bit more in your face. And what they realized early on was that if they used Wilson's own words, how could that possibly be treason? So they were getting accused of that, especially after the U.S. entered the war. So here's a very ill-looking Alice Paul with a banner that reads, "The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there is but one choice, and we have made it." Those are Woodrow Wilson's own words about, so justifying the entry into World War I. And here's another one that they do in August of 1917, Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they weren't self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye, which was really kind of a rude banner. This one hardly even made it out of their suffrage headquarters initially. A mob was standing outside waiting for them, and they tore it apart before they could get over to the White House. But this one caused them quite a lot of trouble. All of this stuff got into the newspapers all over the country, which is exactly what they wanted. But by June, they're starting to get arrested and jailed and force-fed when they went on hunger strikes. And it ends up getting kind of ugly. And remember, these women are perfectly within their First Amendment rights to be picketing, and they're only getting arrested and jailed on the basis of obstructing the sidewalk. So all this stuff, is ending up in the Maine newspapers, and Florence is under a lot of pressure to quit the Congressional Union, to turn against them and decry their tactics, and she absolutely refuses to do it. And so in the end, you can see from this newspaper headline that Congressman Hersey from Maine says the bearers of the Kaiser Wilson banners have the highest motives, and he praises them, but he says they defeated suffrage in Maine. So the defeat of the suffrage referendum, it was defeated 2-1, is really laid at the feet of the Congressional Union. And Florence is their most visible representative in Maine, so she gets a lot of flack for that. And so she really is at odds with her former colleagues in the Maine Woman Suffrage Association at this point. And she decides to leave that organization and just focus on the CU work from here on out. And the Congressional Union changes its name to the National Women's Party, and this is her new letterhead. And you can see she's now moved to the west end of Portland, at 108 Bond Street, a much larger, nicer house there. And a fair exchange is no robbery, is what this letterhead reads. And basically, it should be perfectly all right for women to exchange their political support in exchange, for support of a bill that they're interested in. So from here on out, there's quite a lot of pressure on Florence, because what ends up happening is they know they have enough votes in the U.S. House. It's passed the House, and they need to get it through the Senate. And one of Maine's senators has not said he'd support it. The other one had, but one of Maine's senators, a guy by the name of Frederick Hale, had told Florence during the 1917 suffrage referendum campaign that that he would be bound by Maine's vote, essentially. That if Maine decided to support that referendum and give women the vote, then he would support it in Congress. But if they turned it down, he wouldn't vote for it in Congress. And Florence went to him and said, "You made that promise to me, I release you from it." And but he said, "No, I'm not going to go back on my word. I'm not going to vote for it." But he didn't really oppose suffrage. That's the thing. So he was on the short list of senators that they thought they could turn. And so there's a lot of focus on Maine to get Hale to change his mind. And Alice Paul is constantly writing her, and the headquarters down in Washington are constantly writing Florence and saying, "Can't you do this or that?" Or, they send organizers up to Maine and try and get to set up a big mass meeting to raise money and to raise awareness of Hale and try to get him to change his mind. They do letter writing campaigns, nothing works. And Florence, she had been really pressured to basically denounce the Congressional Union during the referendum campaign and even afterward. But I'm going to read you another excerpt from the book where she talks about one of the cool things about writing this book was actually that I was able to find so much of correspondence and letters to the editor and things like that. So a lot of it can be written in her own words. And so this is still during the war. And one day she comes home, she says, and there's something from the Red Cross exhorting her to help with a food drive. And then there's another, in the same mail, there's a telegram from the National Women's Party saying that women have been arrested and are being held in a crummy jail down in DC. And she says, "In my heart, there's a deep resentment against my country, that at this time when it's demanding the greatest sacrifices from me and from hundreds of thousands of mothers the country over, that democratic principles be advanced in Europe, it refuses to recognize women in that democracy at home. A resentment that in all President Wilson's splendid oratory upon human liberty, there is no inclusion of women as human beings, that women who are responding with sons, money, and service to the government can be mobbed without protest, arrested, and sentenced and placed in prison by the government which is taking their sons and their money and their service to wage its wars." And she says, whether or not we believe the pickets' action is wise, there's no question, but they are within their rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution. The shame of the treatment of the pickets rests upon us if we allow the government at Washington to enforce its maximum penalty upon American women who demand justice without registering our protest. So she is the only voice that I can find in Maine speaking out on behalf of the pickets at this time. So in the end, you know, they don't get Hale's vote. He's such a weasel. He waits until the missing vote is found somewhere else, and then he changes his vote so he can go on record as having supported suffrage, even though his vote was superfluous when it could have been decisive. But this is a telegram that that Florence sends to Alice Paul once they get it through Congress. And she says, "Congratulations and rejoicing. Suffrage victory is due to you and your undaunted fate, splendid vision, and untiring devotion to the cause. I'm proud to be the lowliest of your disciples," which is a really fun way. I mean, my experience with reading all the correspondence from this period is that she has a much more kind of personal and informal style talking to Alice Paul than other suffragists do, at least when in writing. But here's the deal. Hard won, not done. They're through Congress, but they still have to get 3/4 of the states to ratify, because that's the way we amend our Constitution. So, you know, the first states come along pretty quickly, and then it starts slowing down. Part of the problem is that a lot of states have to call a special session, and that's expensive to do at a time when states are struggling financially after the war. And it takes Maine until November of 1919. It passes Congress in June of 1919. Not till November of 1919 that Maine calls a special session, and Governor Milliken, who's here with a quill, is really supportive of suffrage. So they were lucky in that. There were other states where that wasn't the case. And they were really sure it was going to get through their state legislature easily, right up until about a few days before, when all of a sudden the Maine Federation of Labor, just completely out of the blue, publishes a letter in the papers calling on the legislature to vote down the amendment, the ratification of the amendment. And I mean, they just can't figure out, what are you doing? You've been supporting this for, 10 years or more. What's going on? And it turned out that the secretary of the Maine Federation of Labor worked for a very prominent and wealthy auntie in Maine, and they had colluded on this, and he hadn't asked his board. He'd simply, written this letter and sent it out. And so in the end, Alice Paul, this is like an all hands on deck kind of thing, because they're really worried. They know the votes are close in at least the House. So Alice Paul comes up from Washington, and they get through the first day. The Senate approves it 25-5. And then in the next day in the House, they know they're in trouble. So that afternoon, after the Senate votes, Alice Paul and Florence, they grab the Maine Federation of Labor leaders, and they get them in a room up at the Capitol, and they twist arms and tell them, your political careers are over if you don't fix this. And so eventually they prevail, and the president of the Maine Federation of Labor signs a statement that Florence had written out for him, and then she brings it over to her buddy, Lewis Burley, who runs the Kennebec Journal, and gets him to print it in the paper the next morning. So when the House shows up to vote the next morning, each desk in the House chambers has on it a newspaper folded open to that page where the retraction letter is printed, so they can read it and see that the MFL has asked them to go ahead and ratify. It passes the House by 4 votes. So you can see that, without their last-ditch effort, they might not have won it. But Maine becomes the 19th state to ratify the 19th Amendment in November of 1919. And this is the signing ceremony with Carl Milliken signing it. Florence is behind him, and her friend Grace Hill is to her right. And the other 4 women are members of the Maine Woman Suffrage Association. And I just want to note that the quill that he's using, you might see looks kind of striped, and if it were in color, you would see the purple, white, and gold colors of the Congressional Union. This was a quill that had been, dyed specially by the CU or the National Women's Party, and had been sent from state to state to be used in these signing ceremonies. And in using this, I think, Milliken is demonstrating that he knows who the power was behind this positive outcome for the ratification vote in Maine. And then after the ceremony, he gave all the women these ceremonial pens, and the other 5 women all got these kind of ordinary steel pens, but he gave Florence a pearl-handled gold pen, which again, I think demonstrates his awareness that it was her leadership that really won the day. Here's a photo of them. This is on State Street in Portland, and I can't date this picture, but I just love it, and so I'm hoping that it was around this time that the banner says "Votes for Women a Success," so it may be a celebratory ride for them. And if you haven't seen the language of the 19th Amendment, it's the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any states on account of sex. So this simple language in our Constitution took 72 years to get in there. If you count only from 1848, at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention in Western New York, I mean, if you really start from the start of the country, which I think you should, of course, it's much longer, but that's, many generations of women who had to work really hard to get this language into our Constitution. And it wasn't over. I mean, hard won, not done all over again. Even once they won the right to vote, there were still all these challenges. Well, they can vote, but can they be appointed to office, or can they be elected? So right away, there's a challenge in Maine. This is from 1921, and this is a headline where the Supreme Court ends up ruling, because the governor asks them to, that the Constitution does not bar women from sharing in all appointive and elective offices, but they had to go to court. I mean, they had to go to court to get that figured out, and that was the kind of thing that happened in all the states. And it wasn't just this; it was, serving on juries or other jobs being available to them. It was a lot of other work to do to get women to the point where we are today, and we're still not quite there yet. Just if some people don't understand this or aren't aware of this history, but the National American Woman Suffrage Association becomes the League of Women Voters. That happens right away as soon as suffrage is passed or ratified. I should say that the Congressional Union, or the National Women's Party, just goes along and continues its name as the National Women's Party. They don't change their name. But they do in 1923 arrange to have introduced into Congress the Equal Rights Amendment, which you can see looks very similar to the 19th Amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now, this finally passed Congress in 1972, and then it went out to the states for ratification. They had to get 38 states to ratify, and it has never been ratified. And not everybody is aware of that, but they ran into some conservative headwinds, and Phyllis Schlafly most specifically, so it's never been ratified. It is getting close now. Congress had put on an 8-year, or actually first a 7-year, and then they added 3 more years for a 10-year time limit on getting it ratified, and they couldn't get it done within that time period. But they were 3 states short, and those 3 states in the last couple of years they have found. I mean, the states have ratified. So now the question is, what happens now? And this is completely new territory for everybody. I think there's a bill in front of Congress to simply eliminate the time limit, because there have been other federal amendments that didn't have time limits and ended up getting ratified, many, many decades after they were first proposed. So the same should happen here, is the argument. So just to get back to Florence and finish up here, after suffrage was won, she got into all kinds of other community organizing, and took up painting again. Her her husband sadly died in 1924, which was a big shock for her. It was just they'd had a great relationship, and it was really tough to lose him. So that kind of, excuse me, kind of set her sideways for a while. But then she got right back into it. She got very involved in peace activism and had a regular radio program on WGAN in Portland for many years. And here's another of her paintings. These are both of Monhegan. She liked going up to Monhegan to paint. Both of these are still in the family. She also wrote another novel that was sort of loosely based on Squirrel Island, and that was never published. I read it, I got it. It's not her best work, but anyway, she was still working hard trying to make stuff happen for herself. And I love this picture. This is of Florence and her middle son, Robert Bobo, they called him. She died in 1945, right before the U.S. Dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I've always thought was a blessing for her, because I think it would have been, that might have killed her, that alone. She had a big funeral. She was a member of the State Street Church on State Street in Portland, and the governor came and spoke at her funeral, and there were a lot of people there. My mom was 15 at the time and remembered going to that. Hard won, not done. I think it's important that people remember that, you know, I'm going to go back to this slide on Florence. There's still a lot of other work to do on women's rights, but for me, you know, it was such a wonderful journey to get to know Florence. As I said, I didn't know anything about her. If I knew her today, I would think she was a pretty amazing person, but in the context of her own time and place, I think she's quite remarkable. For me, she kind of challenged me to succeed in many spheres, because by her own example, she did that. And she reminds me always that the work that I do is women's work because I choose to do it, not because anybody else defines it as women's work for me. Going back to her poem that I started with. So that's it on my prepared comments. I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. I don't know how this works. If you want to put them in the chat.
Yeah. Well, actually, you could, if you stop sharing your screen now.